It's 4 p.m. Cairo local time and you're now watching Q News. We begin today's bulletin with the latest developments in Gaza. Right, welcome back. The news in detail. The Gaza ceasefire and detainee exchange deal will take effect on Sunday at 8:30 a.m. Gaza local time. This came after Egypt, Qatar and the United States mediated the agreement, which includes a 42-day truce, troop withdrawals from populated areas, aid delivery and detainee exchange. Hamas will release 33 Israeli detainees, while Israel will free 737 Palestinian detainees. Talks for a permanent ceasefire and further exchanges will resume during this period. The Egyptian Ministers of Health and Solidarity have arrived at the Rafah crossing as part of Egypt's intensive efforts to ensure the final preparations for the entry of aid into the Gaza Strip are completed. Earlier, a high-level Egyptian source confirmed to Qnews that the Cairo meeting on implementing the ceasefire agreement in the Gaza Strip has concluded in a positive atmosphere. The source also confirmed that all necessary arrangements had been agreed upon, including the establishment of a joint operations room in Cairo to oversee the implementation of the procedures. Egypt's Foreign Minister Badr Abdulhadi has announced ongoing efforts to deliver aid to Gaza through the Rafah crossing, confirming that 600 trucks will enter daily. Abdulhadi highlighted Egypt's relentless efforts to secure the Gaza ceasefire and reaffirmed the country's ongoing support for Palestinians. He underscored the importance of a two-state solution as a means to prevent future violence, emphasizing Egypt's commitment to ensuring the successful implementation of the truce. The European Union has expressed its gratitude to Egypt, Qatar and the United States for their efforts in mediating the Gaza ceasefire negotiations. In a statement, the EU described the ceasefire agreement as a significant achievement with positive implications for the Middle East. The EU also called for the full and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip. Hamas has stated that the release of Israeli detainees will depend on the number of Palestinian detainees Israel releases. Lists of Palestinian detainees will be shared before each exchange day as part of the agreed ceasefire terms. Hamas also stated that Israel's publication of the agreed list of the detainees for the first phase of the exchange is an action specific to Israel. Hamas has emphasized the urgent need to end the blockade, provide relief to Gaza's people, return displaced individuals, and begin rebuilding the sector. Hamas also highlighted the humanitarian assistance protocol agreed upon under the mediator's supervision, which ensures the implementation of relief, shelter, and reconstruction measures in Gaza. Israeli military vehicles have begun withdrawing from Jabalia in northern Gaza in preparation for the ceasefire agreement. Despite the withdrawal, Israeli airstrikes continue across Gaza, including in Gaza City, Al-Nasr and Al-Karama neighborhoods, although no injuries have been reported. In northern Gaza, Israeli drones maintain control, firing intermittently at movement, while Israeli occupation forces have set fire to homes and ongoing bombings continues in central Gaza's Al-Nusayrat camp. Israeli shelling in the southern Gaza Strip has claimed the lives of 5 civilians last night. Medical sources reported that the civilians were killed when a tent sheltering displaced people in the Al Mawasi area was targeted. Additionally, another woman was injured by gunfire from Israeli forces in western Qnews. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has spoken with French President Emmanuel Macron to discuss recent developments in Palestine. Abbas thanked France for its support of Palestine in international forums, as well as its efforts towards a Gaza ceasefire and humanitarian aid. He reiterated the need for an immediate ceasefire, Israeli withdrawal, and the Palestinian government's full assumptions of responsibility in Gaza. Abbas also called for the acceleration of aid and an end to violations in the West Bank and Jerusalem. The World Health Organization plans to deploy prefabricated hospitals to Gaza within 2 months of ceasefire, estimating that the healthcare sector will need $10 billion for recovery. The WHO stated that starting immediately, displaced Palestinians can return to northern Gaza and free movement will resume across the Strip. Infrastructure rehabilitation, including electricity, water, sanitation and roads, will begin alongside the import of civil defense equipment and debris removal tools as part of the recovery efforts. Head of the UN Palestinian Relief Agency, the UNRWA, Philippe Lazzarini, has said attacks on aid convoys in the Gaza Strip could decline as humanitarian relief floods the area after the truce takes effect between Israel and Hamas. He said UNRWA has 4,000 truckloads of aid, half of which are food and flour, ready to enter the Palestinian enclave. The UN World Food Programme has said it has enough food ready to feed more than 1 million people for 3 months. The UN has described its humanitarian operation as opportunistic, facing problems with Israel's military operation, access restrictions by Israel into and throughout Gaza.
Orderly, uninterrupted, unhindered access to the people.
I have 2 questions for you.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has appointed former Dutch Foreign Minister Sigrid Kaag as the new UN Middle East envoy. Deputy UN spokesperson Farhan Haq said that Kaag will also remain in her current role as the UN Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. He added that Kaag's appointment as the Middle East envoy is temporary while Guterres continues to search for a permanent replacement for Tor Winsland, who stepped down at the end of last year after 4 years in the position.
With her present mandate as the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, pursuant to
Israeli media has reported that the majority of Israelis support the detainee swap deal and ceasefire with Hamas. 73% of Israelis back the detainee exchange deal, with 45% strongly supporting and 28% somewhat supporting it. Israeli media reported that only 19% opposed the deal, while 8% remain undecided. Support is stronger among opposition party supporters at 91% compared to 52% among coalition party backers. The survey conducted from January 15th to 16th included 509 adult participants. Israeli military spokesperson for Arab media, Avichai Drai, has announced preparations to implement the detainee exchange agreement, which was previously approved by Israel's political and security leadership. The Israeli army is preparing for the release of detainees from Gaza, ensuring both physical and psychological support. Additionally, security measures will remain in place for Israeli citizens, particularly those near Gaza's border. And for more analysis, we now move to Salma Marwan in our newsroom. To you, Salma.
Thank you, Mona. And for further analysis on the current situation in Gaza amid the agreement negotiations, we're joined by Al Ahram Weekly Managing Editor, Mr. Khalid Dawood. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us on Qnews. So, with the ceasefire and detainee exchange agreement going into effect in less than 24 hours, can you kindly explain the main features of the agreement in terms of the number of phases and the actual measures on the ground?
Well, thank you, Salma, for having me. Well, as a matter of fact, it's a rather complicated agreement with many arrangements, all related to the exchange of Israeli hostages in return for Palestinian prisoners. That's a very critical point that's going to happen once a week. The first group of hostages, reportedly 3 Israeli women hostages, are supposed to be released tomorrow in return for 95 Palestinian prisoners. If all goes well, the Israeli troops should start redeployment within the Gaza Strip, pulling away from so-called populated areas and concentrate their troops on the border of Gaza with Israel and with Egypt. Again, if all goes fine and all the arrangements continue going ahead, we're going to start seeing a second stage of exchange of prisoners happening next Saturday. And the agreement is each week within the first period of 42 days, or 7 weeks, we're going to see a group of Israeli hostages released in return for Palestinian prisoners, and redeployment of Israeli forces within the Gaza Strip, allowing the displaced Palestinians from southern Gaza to go back to their homes in northern Gaza. This is a matter that's not going to be very easy because Israel is demanding some sort of a search procedure for the Palestinians preparing to return to the north. And if all goes well, I mean, within all these complicated procedures, on the 16th day of the implementation of the first phase of the agreement, the parties are supposed to negotiate the details of the second stage, which is definitely far more critical because it will move from a temporary truce to a permanent ceasefire and the release of the remaining Israeli living hostages and more Palestinian security prisoners, ones who are dubbed by Israel who have so-called blood on their hands, or ones who have received life sentences. These are supposed to be released more in the second stage. And again, if the second stage is agreed, we move to the third and final stage, which is supposed to see the exchange of the dead Israeli hostages in return for more Palestinian prisoners, and more important, the beginning of a reconstruction plan, a very ambitious reconstruction plan for the Gaza Strip that has been practically totally destroyed, leveled to the ground after more than 15 months of Israeli bombardment. Along with the first stage, let me point out that there's going to be a surge in humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian side. As you've mentioned,
sir, we'll get to this point later, but I want to ask you, in terms of sustainability, will this agreement be able to withstand all the expected challenges given Israel's terrible record in terms of honoring its obligations in this regard?
Well, that's a very important question that everybody's waiting for and is suspecting that it's going to happen, exactly because of what you mentioned about the Israeli long record of finding excuses to break the agreement, and let alone the internal pressures within the current right-wing extremist Israeli government. We've already seen leaders of 2 extremist Zionist parties, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, voting against the agreement. These parties are not going to stop calling for the resumption of fighting for whatever reason they might see as a reason for resuming the bombing. But within this context as well comes the role of the mediators, the 3 parties that have helped reach this agreement, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar. They are going to have an operation room in Cairo, Egypt, overseeing the implementation of the agreement. And both parties are supposed to report to this committee any reported violations in a manner relatively similar to what we've seen happening in Lebanon after the ceasefire reached at the end of November between Israel and the Lebanese side. So again, it's a very kind of cautious optimism about the chances and the prospects of the success of this agreement, and equally important, as I mentioned, moving from the first stage, that of temporary truce, to a final end for this war in the second stage, which is going to be another very important challenge for the parties and for the mediators who are guaranteeing this agreement.
Now, going back to the humanitarian aid, what are the measures that will be adopted in order to ensure the uninterrupted flow of humanitarian aid to Gaza as per the agreement?
Well, according to the agreement signed between the two sides on the first day of the agreement, as soon as the first group of Israeli hostages are released and the group of Palestinian prisoners are also released, we're going to see a surge, a major surge in the amount of aid that's being allowed inside Gaza. I mean, as we all know, after the Israelis invaded Rafah in May, almost like more than 8 months ago, there's been very, very little aid getting into Gaza. Maybe we're talking about 20 or 30 trucks a day compared to the level that's very much needed by the people in Gaza after a determined policy of starvation. We're talking about nearly 600 trucks a day, including trucks of fuel that's very much needed for the hospitals in Gaza, for the sewage operations, as well as the bakeries. All those important sectors that depend on fuel will very much need that fuel coming in through the Rafah crossing point. There is supposed to be also an entry in large numbers in mobile homes for the Palestinians who have been displaced, as well as thousands of tents that are also supposed to go through the first stage. So again, it all depends, I might note here, on the Israeli side, because again, these trucks are not going to get from Arish or Rafah into the Egyptian side into the Israeli side before being searched by the Israeli side. So, I mean, again, the Israelis have a horrible record in delaying the entry of humanitarian aid because of this complicated search operation. So hopefully the presence of international organizations is going to help smooth that operation. But again, it all depends. Expectations are not necessarily very optimistic, but there's no other option but to begin this complicated process of ceasefire, because Palestinian people definitely they need a respite from this barbaric attacks that have been happening on a daily basis. We can see up until today they are still bombing Palestinians, although I mean reports have said
Yes,
that the
sir,
Palestinians
your
have
point
demanded
is
some
clear,
period
but
of calm
now,
before the
sorry for
agreement goes into
interrupting you,
effect.
sir, but I would like to delve into Israel's internal matters. How do you assess the public opinion in Israel regarding the detainee swap and ceasefire deal?
Well, again, I think that one of the main reasons Mr. Netanyahu has been repeatedly delaying this agreement is to maintain his right-wing coalition together and to avoid accountability. I mean, again, one scenario is that as soon as the prisoners are exchanged with Israeli hostages and the agreement goes into effect, the Israelis are going to turn inwards and again increase demands for accountability for the October 7 attack, in which Hamas managed to basically infiltrate all the Israeli borders and walls and inflict extremely heavy losses on the Israeli side. So, I mean, again, there is a possible scenario of the collapse of the current government if there is too much infighting among its factions over the implementation of the agreement. That we've already heard Ben Gvir and Smotrich criticizing the agreement because of the alleged release of the Palestinian prisoners who might go back to military attacks against Israel from their point of view. But again, let's not forget another very important factor that's going to happen, which is the U.S. president getting back into the White House, Mr. Donald Trump, to start his term on Monday, and a lot will depend on the new U.S. president is going to be willing to put pressure on the Israeli side to carry out the agreement, or he's going to give them some compromises in order to encourage them to carry out the agreement. And unfortunately, those compromises could be allowing the expansion of settlements in the West Bank, or the recognition of certain major settlements in the West Bank as part of the Israeli territory. So that's also another source of major worry about how internal politics is going to affect the way the upcoming U.S. President Donald Trump is going to deal with Netanyahu and his extremist government.
Lastly, sir, what role will international organizations play in monitoring the ceasefire and the reconstruction efforts?
Well, the monitoring process is going to be the responsibility of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. Those are the three parties that mediated the agreement and are going to monitor its implementation. Of course, the humanitarian organizations are going to have a very extremely important role in the distribution of aid within Gaza, especially if the Israelis insisted on their decision to ban UNRWA from acting freely within the occupied Palestinian territory. So we're going to see a bigger role played by the World Food Organization, by the UN Humanitarian Office, UNICEF, all these Doctors Without Borders, all these big international organizations are certainly going to increase their efforts in the coming days and weeks to be able to meet the many basic needs of the Palestinian people, at least to give them some relief after we started hearing of babies dying because of the cold weather, but because of starvation. So there's a lot of work certainly to be done by the international humanitarian organizations, and I hope that the Israelis will look into a way to allow UNRWA to start and resume its work within the Gaza Strip, because so far there is no other alternative agency that can carry out the kind of work that UNRWA has been doing.
That was Al Ahram Weekly Managing Editor, Mr. Khalid Dawood. Thank you so much for joining us here on Q News and for all the information you provided us with. And now we're going to move back to Mona in the studio.
Thank you so much, Salma. And moving on to Cairo, where Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has emphasized that Libya's stability is integral to Egypt's national security. This came during a meeting with the Libyan National Army Commander, Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar. President Sisi highlighted Egypt's efforts to ensure Libya's unity, prevent foreign interference, and support development. Libya's Haftar praised Egypt's pivotal role in restoring stability, combating terrorism, and sharing its developmental expertise. Both leaders reaffirmed the importance of a unified roadmap for Libya's elections and sovereignty. And moving on to Beirut, the Lebanese President Joseph Aoun has stated that ongoing Israeli violations and the destruction of border villages in southern Lebanon completely contradict the terms of the ceasefire agreement. During a meeting with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Aoun emphasized Lebanon's commitment to the withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces from the south by the deadline specified in the ceasefire agreement. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has expressed full support for Lebanon, emphasizing readiness to mobilize international support for the country's recovery. During his meeting with President Joseph Aoun, Guterres expressed solidarity with the Lebanese people and their government, emphasizing the potential for strengthening Lebanese institutions and ensuring full protection for citizens once Israeli forces withdraw. He also praised Lebanon's resilience, noting that reconstruction would begin as soon as the conflict ends. And moving on to Syria, the foreign minister has expressed for anticipation for the country's return to the Arab League as the new leadership seeks to reassert its position in the regional political landscape. Asad Hassan al-Shaybani made his remarks during a joint press conference in Damascus with Arab League Assistant Secretary General Hussam Zaki, who announced that the Arab League is collaborating with member states to restore Syrians' participation. That brings us to the end of our news bulletin. Here is what we've been covering. The Gaza ceasefire and detainee exchange begins on January 19th. Egyptian ministers arrive in Rafah for final aid entry preparations. And Israeli military vehicles withdraw from northern Gaza. This concludes our news bulletin for the hour. Don't forget to follow Q News on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok at Q News EGY to stay informed. Many thanks for watching and stay tuned for more updates on Q News.